I just don't think they're good enough.
It's funny. I told the kids this morning when we were over here, I'm like, we're going to make cars dumb. And you're like, I want a dumb one.
Yeah, exactly. At least have the option of getting one.
All these computers and stuff.
There's down one. PC bar. I mean, because I just don't think they make it, an $80,000. I just don't think they make $80,000. In my mind.
I don't know how someone pays $80,000 for a pickup truck. This is the most ridiculous. Something's not right here.
They give you increase your intelligence.
Yeah.
Make you more sexually potent or something.
Right.
For that
I'm waiting.
Smarter or something.
I'm at a pickup. I'm no more than 20,000. Yeah, I'm not paying any more than that. Not even that either. I'm too cheap.
Would you use it?
Yeah, well, if you buy a pickup, you use it. If you buy a pickup, you use it.
Good morning. Last week we read about the washing of Jesus' feet and Judas leaving the supper to go betray Jesus, and we'll wrap up the last few verses of chapter 13 today and move on to chapter 14. And this section is often called the farewell address of Jesus because he has a private conversation for quite a long time with his disciples. And because it's a private conversation, and because they don't understand it all at the time, because he gets into some things that he tells them, you'll understand this later. The Holy Spirit will help you. You're not going to find this kind of thing in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are intended for the preaching of the gospel to people who have never heard the gospel before. This is intended for Jesus' inner circle of disciples. Starting in John 13, verse 31, all the way through the end of chapter 16, it's usually called the farewell address of Jesus. And much of it not understood, which is one of the themes of the whole Gospel of John. So we'll take a look at, starting in verse 31. When he had gone out, he being Judas Iscariot had left the dinner. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Children, I'm with you a little while longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come. And so now I tell you, I give you a new commandment, love one another. Just as I have loved you, you must also love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." So he talks, without explaining a whole lot, that he's going to go. I'm going to depart. What does that mean? Well, I don't think that they understood any of this at the time. He's making an allusion to going away by death. But at this moment, his disciples don't understand what he's saying. And of course, this is something that we've talked about in the past, but it's important. He says, I give you a new commandment, love one another. Just as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Well, what's new about that? Haven't we been told to love one another in the Bible in multiple ways before this? Throughout Jesus' life and even in the Old Testament. But notice that phrase, just as I have loved you. And this is a command that you have to love sacrificially, even to the point of death. Now, of course, this was spoken to the 12 disciples. 11 of them, Judas Iscariot was gone. He's telling them, he's getting them ready for what's about to happen to them. They're about to become his representatives on earth after he ascends to heaven, after the resurrection. And one of the themes of this whole farewell address in these little over 3 chapters is you're going to face persecution. Be ready for it. These 11 men are going to face persecution, even become martyrs. And so they have to be ready to love, not just in the way that we're told, say, in the Golden Rule, treat people well, like you want to be treated. Well, he's saying you have to love to the point of death. That's what's new about it. When he says, as I have loved you, well, they're about to discover that how has Jesus loved them? He's loved them to the point of the cross, to the point of death. And now he's laying a much more burdensome commandment on them than just love other people. He's saying, love like I love, to the point of death. Then we come, after he forecasts that Peter will deny him, and Peter says, no, I won't. We come to chapter 14, a famous passage where Jesus says, I'm the way, and the truth, and the life. Verses 1 through 6 of chapter 14. Your heart must not be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If not, I would have told you. I'm going away to prepare a place for you. If I go away and prepare a place for you, I will come back and receive you to myself, so that where I am, you may be also. You know the way where I am going. Lord, Thomas said, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? Jesus told him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. There's a lot here in these 6 verses. In verse 1, he says, believe in God, believe also in me. Or believe in the Father, believe also in me. A lot of Jews might have thought that's blasphemous. He's equating believing in God and believing in him as equal commandments. You can't imagine a preacher today getting up and saying, believe in God, also believe in me. I mean, I would never say that in the pulpit. That's you know, that would seem way out of bounds. But Jesus, in direct ways and subtle ways, is saying the Son of God is equal to the Father. He is not just a human teacher. Verse 2. He's trying to give them in this farewell address comfort. Because pretty soon he's going to be crucified. He's going to die. He's going to be buried. And despair might come. And so he tries to tell them in verse 2, yeah, I'm leaving you through death. I'm going away. But don't worry. I'm going away not because I'm abandoning you. I'm going away because I'm going to heaven to prepare a place for you. We'll be together again someday. And so that's what comes across in verse 2. Now, at this point in time, do they understand what all that means? Do they, he's going to be buried, and then he's going to be resurrected, and after a while he's going to ascend back to heaven? Well, no, we've read all that, but we got to put our minds at this moment in time. Put yourself in their shoes. What does this mean? Could they possibly understand it all? I'm leaving you, but it's because I'm going to prepare a place for you in heaven. At this moment in time, that's not really comprehensible to them. of course, is one of the themes of the whole Gospel of John. Is John relating the things that they didn't understand at the time. And in many, many cases, most of the cases, the reason that they did not understand something at the time in the Gospel of John is because the crucifixion and the resurrection and the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to them have to happen before they can understand. And sometimes we lose sight of that because we've read multiple times to the end of the story in the Gospels. But that wasn't their case. Now, in verse 3, one of our members asked me a few weeks ago, why would Jesus say, if I go away and prepare a place for you? He just said in verse 2, I am going away and preparing a place for you. So, does if imply some sort of uncertainty about the future? Or should that word be interpreted in a different way? If I go away and prepare a place for you. Well, one of my rules is don't talk Greek and Hebrew unless you have to. But unfortunately, we'll get through this quickly, but in order to really understand what he's saying, we take a little excursion into the Greek. Because a conditional statement is an if statement. If A, then B. And we have a lot of those in English. Sometimes we have only if A, then B. Well, in Greek, there are 5 different forms of conditionals, called first-class conditionals down to 5th-class conditionals. And they all look different in Greek, but in English, in our English translation, they're all going to show up looking like if, then. And so, which of the 5 classes was it? This is what's called a third-class conditional in Greek. And the idea is not some sort of uncertainty about the future. In the first-class conditional, you can have that. But this is not Jesus saying, I'm not really sure if I'm going to prepare you a place. It's not uncertainty about the future. Rather, a third-class conditional of this form, there's actually class 3A and 3B, and this is 3B, but we won't get into that. In this form, what is being said in the if A, then B, is that B and A, B is totally dependent upon A. B only happens if A happens. It's not any uncertainty. So let's kind of rephrase it to make it clearer in English. Only if I go away will you have a place prepared. Okay? So it's not that the going away is uncertain. Rather, he's saying, you won't have a place unless I go away. And so, once again, this is the theme of comforting them. I'm going away, but don't worry, don't despair over me going away, because I have to go away. Only if I do go away will you have a place promised for you in heaven. And so, you can imagine this paraphrasing from the Gospels, Jesus saying, if a tree is good, it will bear good fruit. If a tree is bad, it will bear bad fruit. That word if is not some sort of uncertainty about some future thing. It's a statement about right now, about the dependency. Having good fruit depends upon having a good tree. Having bad fruit depends upon having a bad tree. And so on. It's not about the future. It's not a chronological if. It's not about uncertainty about the future. So what Jesus is saying here is simply not that his going away is uncertain. He's saying having a place in heaven depends upon me going away. So when I go away, don't worry about it. It's for a good reason. And we can see other examples nearby like in John 11, if anyone walks during the day, this is when Jesus is talking about, I'm the light of the world. If anyone walks during the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world, natural sunlight. And then Jesus is bracketing this with saying that he is a spiritual light. He is the light of this world in a spiritual sense. This is a dependency if. Not stumbling depends on walking in the daytime, seeing light. It's not if something in the future that's uncertain. And in fact, we just read one. I realized as I was reading it, we read something in parallel back in John 13, verses 31 and 32. When he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. So that if is not an uncertainty. It's the exact same thing. The previous verse is absolutely certain. God is glorified in Jesus. And if so, I mean, God will glorify him in himself. So it's a dependency, not an uncertainty. Now, back to chapter 14. After he reveals he's the way, the truth, and the life. You'll notice that in verse 5, something characteristic of John, he names other disciples a lot more than we find in other Gospels. Thomas is the one who says, what are you talking about? We don't know where you're going. How do we know the way? And that is the cue for Jesus to say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me. That's an exclusive statement of truth, an exclusive statement of salvation that's very unpopular in a pluralistic and tolerant world of today. How dare you say that this is one path to God? Can't every religion on the whole earth be a path to God? You know, even if obviously many of them are pagan religions that people made up themselves, but that's a much more popular viewpoint, non-judgmental and so on. But we have this statement from Jesus. Jesus was sent from the Father to earth. He is the way for you to know the Father. Period. Then, later, Jesus gets to a very important topic of the Holy Spirit. We start in verse 15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And I will ask the Father. And by the way, that's another third-class conditional. If you love me, you will keep commandments. It's not an uncertainty if. It's defining what love is. Love means, loving Jesus means keeping his commandments. If you don't love Jesus, there'll be no reason for you to keep his commandments. And if you do, you will. Period. There's no possibility of, well, I love Jesus, but I don't keep his commandments. It's the good tree, good fruit. These things are always associated with each other. The good tree and the good fruit are always together. Loving Jesus and keeping his commandments are always together. He's not speaking in the future tense with an uncertain if about the future. If you love me, he's saying, this is what love is. You love Jesus, you keep his commandments. And then in verse 16, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another counselor to be with you forever. He is the Spirit of truth. The world is unable to receive him because it doesn't see him or know him, but you do know him because he remains with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans, I'm coming. So, the Holy Spirit is said to be, and there's this strange Greek word that's translated counselor or advocate. It's actually a legal term. If you were on trial in a courtroom, you have a lawyer arguing on your behalf. He is your counselor or advocate. That's this Greek word here. And he's representing you, arguing on your behalf. So the comfort being offered to the disciples is, I'm going to go away. And you're going to be persecuted, and I've already told you, you're going to need to love me to the point of death. But don't worry, because the Holy Spirit's going to be with you. He's going to be there fighting for you. Just like in a courtroom, you're not abandoned to make your own case. You've got the lawyer there with you. The Holy Spirit will be with you. Now, the King James Version says comforter. And that's not really the greatest translation, honestly, the knowledge of Greek at the time of the King James. Comforter isn't the same, and your lawyer isn't there in the courtroom to comfort you. He's there to fight for you. Helper in the New King James Version, that is accurate, but that's a little bit broad. It doesn't have that legal context of conflict necessarily. You can help somebody, not necessarily in a conflict, right? But the word is, you're going to be in conflict, and you're going to have somebody there advocating for you. You're going to have somebody fighting for you. Down in verse 26, Jesus says something else about the Holy Spirit. But the Counselor, the Holy Spirit, the Father will send him in my name, will teach you all things and remind you of everything I have told you. That's important for their oral teaching, but also for when some of them start to write down the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, which they've been doing all along probably. But when they start bringing it all together into Gospels, the Holy Spirit is going to help them remember. And then we have a final message of peace. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Your heart must not be troubled or fearful. You have heard me tell you, I am going away, and I am coming to you. Once again, they don't know what that means. He's going away, but he's not abandoning them. What does this mean? Well, they don't know yet. But he's trying to give them peace of mind. If you loved me, you would have rejoiced that I'm going to the Father, because the Father is greater than I. I have told you now, before it happens, so that when it does happen, you may believe. Jesus knows they're not understanding this. I've told you now, before it happens, so that when the crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, happen, they'll finally understand it. Jesus knows they can't possibly understand all this right now. It doesn't make sense to them right now. But he's telling them explicitly, I'm telling you now so you'll understand it later. I will not talk with you much longer, because the ruler of the world is coming, but he has no power over me. On the contrary, I am going away so that the world may know that I love the Father, just as the Father commanded me, so I do. So Jesus leaves them, once again, when you tell someone you're leaving them, that's disconcerting, especially in their situation. So multiple times he has to keep saying, I'm leaving, but it's okay. Don't worry. I'm leaving, but it's to prepare a place for you in heaven. I'm leaving, but I'm sending the Holy Spirit back to help you. I'm leaving, but I'm coming to you also after the resurrection. And so on. So that everything he has in this portion of the farewell discourse is preparing them for crucifixion, burial, resurrection, ascension. And as you recall from reading the Gospels, when he's crucified and buried, At that point, do they understand it all? Or at that point, are they still very worried? Well, of course, it's not until he's resurrected that they stop worrying. Because they didn't understand this. Because this is very hard to understand. When Jesus was crucified and buried, the disciples were fearful. Maybe we're going to get arrested next. Maybe we'll get killed next. And the man we've been following, the teacher we've been following, is gone. He's dead. That was the state of mind they were in. Until the resurrection. The resurrection is what changed everything. And that's what we remember, particularly on Easter, but all the time as Christians. The resurrection took a bunch of afraid followers of Jesus, uncertain about what comes next, and transformed them into people who love to the point of death, to becoming martyrs. We see in the book of Acts when the authorities called Peter, James, and John in and say, you're going to stop teaching us stuff. And they said, well, we have to obey God, not men. And they were simply unafraid of what punishment they might get on earth. How do you go from being these afraid men to being those men that we read about in the book of Acts? Well, when Jesus is resurrected from the dead and appears to you, and you get to touch him and realize it's really him, that changes everything. That's what Easter's about. And that's what Jesus is trying to prepare them for. But once again, he knows the whole time, they're not going to understand all this until the resurrection. Until I appear to them, they will not understand. And I'm even telling them, I'm telling you this so you'll understand later. They can't possibly understand it now, but they will. And they will in a matter of days. Because all these chapters of John are we're into just the last few days of Jesus' life. Right? He's, in 24 hours or so, he's going to be dead from this. So he's preparing. So let's take a look quickly, just to get kind of the big picture. Where does this all fit in? What is this farewell discourse? Well, first he tells them his departure is imminent. But then the theme is, but don't worry, I'm leaving to prepare a place for you. And don't worry because I'm sending you the Holy Spirit to fight on your behalf. In chapter 15 we'll see, I am the true vine. And in verse 5, you have to stay connected to the true vine in order to grow, in order to survive. Without the true vine, Jesus, you can't do anything. Then they're warned of persecution. There's a lengthy passage. You've got to be prepared to be witnesses to a world that's going to hate you. But the final note, the final verse of chapter 16, don't worry. I have already conquered the world. The world will hate you, but I've already achieved a victory over the world. And by the time the world is hating them, the cross will have happened. The crucifixion and resurrection will have happened. And he will have achieved that victory over the world by that time. By the time that they start getting persecuted. We'll pick up in chapter 15 next week.
Nice out.